The arena trembles with the roars of thousands of Vorak warriors, their bloodlust thick in the air. The moment has come. Their champion stands, waiting. And then, the human steps forward. The war drums pounded like the heartbeat of the Vorak Imperium itself, deep, thunderous, unyielding. A storm of battle cries erupted from the Colosseum stands, shaking the air, a chorus of sharpened steel and violent expectation. Master Khan Zorval stood at the center of the bloodsteel arena, his massive frame radiating raw power, his plated exoskeleton gleaming beneath the pale red sky. His plasma-edged greatsword rested heavily across his shoulder, a weapon that had ended 1,000 lives. He watched, amused, as his challenger entered the ring. A human. The laughter from the Vorak audience was deafening, rippling across the stadium like rolling thunder. A mere human, clad in a worn combat suit, nothing ceremonial, nothing grand. He was lean, unarmored, holding a single monomolecular vibroblade in his right hand, an insult to the sacred nature of Vorak duels. Zorval smirked. "You stand before the greatest duelist in the Imperium, and you bring that?" He motioned lazily at Kane's weapon, as if addressing a child with a toy. Kane just rolled his shoulders, tilting his head slightly, eyes scanning his opponent. Measuring. Calculating. "Yeah," he said finally, voice as casual as if they were talking over a bar counter. "Figured it'd be enough." More laughter. Zorval chuckled, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "I'll make this quick. I respect warriors, human, but your kind are not warriors. You rely on ships, on weapons, on numbers. But this?" He gestured around the arena. "This is battle in its purest form. This is where the strong prove their dominance. Where the weak fall." Kane smirked, shifting his stance slightly. "That so?" The Vorak High Warlords sat on their raised thrones above the arena, their expressions indifferent. The duel had already been decided in their eyes. A formality. A spectacle. The Vorak war priest stepped forward, raising a clawed hand. Silence fell instantly. He bellowed the sacred words. "Let blood decide." The war drum stopped. Zorval moved first. A blur of motion, faster than something of his size should be able to move. His greatsword came down in a brutal, sweeping arc, the sheer force of it splitting the air with a deafening hum. Kane wasn't there. The blade smashed into the stone where he had been standing, obliterating the arena floor in a pulse of molten sparks. The impact sent a shockwave outward, dust rising in a choking cloud. Then, pain. Zorval barely had time to register it before warm blood sprayed from his wrist. Kane was already behind him. The human's vibroblade had slashed through his armor, the cut deep and surgical. He hadn't even seen him move. Hadn't even felt the blade pierce. A ripple of silence spread through the arena. A Vorak had been wounded first. Zorval growled, flexing his injured wrist. It wasn't deep, just a flesh wound, but it was impossible. No challenger had ever landed the first strike. Kane's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Slow." The word burned into Zorval's mind like a brand. His mandibles flared wide in anger. "You dare." Kane moved again. Zorval barely raised his greatsword in time, catching Kane's second attack, a brutal upward slash aimed for his throat. Sparks exploded from the contact, but Kane had already twisted, his elbow slamming into Zorval's jaw. Crack. The Master Khan stumbled back. His vision blurred for a half-second, long enough for Kane to slam the hilt of his blade against the back of his knee. Zorval went down. The entire arena gasped. A Vorak never kneeled in combat. Kane stepped back, watching, waiting. His stance loose, casual, like he was toying with his opponent. Zorval snarled, rage boiling over. He pushed off the ground, exploding forward with raw fury, unleashing a vicious, sweeping attack meant to cut Kane in half. Kane sidestepped. Again. Effortlessly. Then he punished. His boot slammed into Zorval's knee, hard. A sickening pop filled the arena. Zorval roared in agony as he collapsed sideways, crashing into the ground. Kane pounced. The vibroblade pressed against Zorval's throat before the Vorak even realized what had happened. The arena was dead silent. Zorval's chest heaved. His mind raced. The realization dawned. He wasn't fighting a warrior. He was fighting a killer. Kane crouched slightly, pressing the blade just enough to let Zorval feel the edge, to let him understand. "You talk too much," Kane murmured. Zorval stared at him. No one had ever beaten him. And this human had just ended the fight in under a minute. Kane didn't move, didn't strike the final blow. Instead, he spoke, calm, merciless. "You wanted to see how humans fight?" He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a duel." Zorval's blood ran cold. Kane's voice dropped lower. "This is a killing field." For the first time in Vorak history, a duel master knelt in surrender. For the first time, humanity's true nature was revealed to them. The Vorak thought they were the greatest warriors in the galaxy. But today, in the Bloodsteel arena, with the silence of 1,000 stunned warriors hanging in the air, they realized they were wrong. The silence in the arena was absolute. The Vorak had never witnessed one of their own fall in a duel, much less kneel and surrender. The war drums had stopped, and all that remained was the scent of blood and the weight of something unfamiliar, fear. Zorval's breathing was ragged, his vision blurred. His body screamed in protest as he fought to push himself upright, but Kane's vibroblade remained firm against his throat. It was not trembling. Not shifting. Absolute stillness. The human wasn't even winded. A whisper of movement. Kane withdrew his blade, stepping back. "Get up," he said, voice devoid of amusement, of ceremony. "Just a simple demand." Zorval gritted his teeth and rose slowly, shame burning through him. He had never been forced to his knees before, never felt this weak. The very idea that a human, a primate, had bested him was unfathomable. His hands clenched into fists. Kane tilted his head slightly, watching, waiting. "Still breathing? Good. Let's see if you can last longer than 30 seconds this time." Rage surged through Zorval's veins, drowning out pain. The Vorak were warriors. He had trained for decades, mastered 1,000 forms, carved his way through battlefields to stand as the Imperium's greatest duelist. He would not, could not, fall to this. With a roar that shook the arena, Zorval lunged forward, his great sword igniting in a brilliant blue arc. He came in fast, reckless, every ounce of his strength poured into one single devastating overhead strike. Kane didn't move. At the last moment, as the blade screamed downward, Kane sidestepped and let it pass. Zorval's own momentum carried him forward, off balance, vulnerable. Kane struck. A precise slash along the Vorak's right thigh, deep enough to cut tendons. Zorval barely had time to register the pain before another blow to his side, a calculated, effortless movement. The Vorak stumbled, panting, his blade digging into the arena floor for support. He lifted his head and saw Kane watching him. No smirk. No arrogance. Just clinical, unshaken focus. Zorval snarled, pushing himself up. "You mock me." Kane was already inside his guard before the sentence was finished. A brutal elbow to the jaw sent Zorval reeling backward. The world spun, his vision blurred. Before he could recover, something slammed into the back of his knee, and he went down again, this time, face first into the dirt. Kane's foot pressed down on his wrist, pinning his sword hand. "You're slow," Kane murmured. "Predictable. Heavy on form, light on instinct." His voice was almost disappointed. Zorval growled, muscles straining. "I am a Vorak duelmaster. Kane lifted his foot and stomped down on Zorval's wrist. The sickening crunch of shattered bone echoed through the arena. Zorval's scream was inhuman. The crowd flinched. The Vorak had never seen one of their own broken. Kane crouched beside the fallen champion, gripping him by the back of the head, forcing Zorval to look at him. You don't get it, do you? Kane's voice was low, even. Not mocking, not gloating, just cold, ruthless certainty. This was never a duel. Zorval trembled beneath his grip, his pride cracking. His certainty shattering. Kane tightened his hold. I wasn't trained in a temple. I didn't spend decades perfecting the art of fighting. I learned to kill. There's a difference. He let go, rising to his feet. Zorval barely managed to roll onto his back, panting. Kane turned his back on him. A deep insult in Vorak culture. The crowd was silent. No roars, no cheers, just a stunned, disbelieving stillness. Kane walked to the center of the arena, blade still dripping with blood. He looked up at the high warlords seated above, their normally stoic expressions unreadable. You wanted to see what humanity was capable of? Kane called, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed Colosseum. He lifted his blade, tapping it against his shoulder. This was just me. The implication hit like a thunderclap. One human. One. And their greatest warrior had been reduced to nothing. The Vorak High warlords remained unmoving, their silence stretching into something far heavier than mere contemplation. It was realization. Kane exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He turned back to Zorval, who was still struggling to rise, blood pooling beneath him. Stay down, Kane said simply. Not as a taunt. As a warning. Zorval locked eyes with him. And for the first time in his life, he obeyed. Kane nodded once, then turned his gaze to the high warlords again. You think war with humans will be your greatest victory? He sheathed his blade. His next words froze the entire stadium. You have no idea how wrong you are. A slow, terrible realization crept across the Vorak. For the first time in their long history, they knew fear. The air in the arena was thick with something unfamiliar. The Vorak called it defeat. But for the first time in their long and blood-stained history, they were beginning to understand a deeper, far more terrifying concept: annihilation. Zorval lay in the dirt, his vision swimming, his breath ragged. His wrist was broken, his body battered, his pride shattered beyond repair. Never, not once in his life, had he known the sensation of helplessness. He had been raised in the ways of the blade, trained to be the finest duelist in the Imperium. And yet, he could barely hold onto his weapon. Kane stood above him, hands loose at his sides, no signs of strain. The human had not fought like a warrior. He had not fought with honor. He had fought like something far worse, something ruthless, precise, merciless. Zorval struggled onto his knees, his greatsword lying useless at his side. His voice was a rasp of barely restrained fury. This isn't how battle is fought. Kane exhaled through his nose, almost amused. That right? He paced in slow, deliberate steps, eyes never leaving the broken champion. You thought this was a fight? He shook his head. No. This was a lesson. Zorval bared his fangs. You mock me. I taught you something today, Kane interrupted, voice cool, even. You just don't understand it yet. Zorval forced himself upright, swaying. His legs barely held him, his balance unsteady. He lifted his head toward the high warlords above, his mandibles clicking in silent shame. The warlords did not meet his gaze. Kane smirked, just a little. You see it now, don't you? Zorval turned, anger still flickering in his eyes, but it was not alone anymore. There was something else there now, something dangerous. Doubt. Kane let the silence stretch before speaking again. You thought humans were weak. That without numbers, without technology, without weapons of war, we'd fold. His expression turned cold, eyes sharp as his blade. But you don't get it. You never got it. Zorval's jaw clenched, his breath ragged. And what, he growled, is it that I do not understand? Kane stopped pacing. Looked him dead in the eye. War isn't about honor. His voice was calm, almost casual. It's about who's left standing. A hush fell over the entire Colosseum. The Vorok had spent centuries perfecting the art of combat, crafting techniques and rituals, binding themselves to their sacred traditions. But none of it had mattered. None of it. Cain had broken Zorval without ceremony, without hesitation. There had been no grace in it, no poetry. Just an inevitable, unstoppable reality. Humanity didn't fight for sport. They fought to win. Zorval's claws curled into fists. He wanted to deny it, to lash out, to fight. But every instinct in his body screamed the truth at him. He had already lost. Cain studied him for a moment, then scoffed, shaking his head. "I've seen that look before," he muttered. Same expression a rookie gets when they survive their first real battle. Zorval stiffened. "You compare me to a child?" Cain's gaze sharpened. "No. I'm comparing you to someone who's just realized they don't know a damn thing about the world." The words landed like a physical blow. From above, the Vorok High warlords finally stirred. Their leader, a figure wrapped in a crimson war cloak, leaned forward. His voice was low, carrying across the silent arena like a distant drumbeat. "Human," the warlord said, his tone unreadable. "Do you claim victory?" Cain didn't even hesitate. "I claim the truth," he said simply. "You don't want a war with us." A murmur rippled through the audience. Uncertainty. Disbelief. Cain took a slow step forward, toward the raised throne of the warlords, his posture still relaxed, still unconcerned. "You thought you were fighting the best we had." He let the silence stretch, then gave them the final cut. "You weren't." The tension snapped like a live wire. The Vorok had no words. Zorval's breath hitched, realization hitting him like a hammer. Cain had defeated him without truly trying. What did that mean for the rest of his kind? Cain turned back to him, eyes cold. "Tell me, champion. What happens when a species like mine doesn't send its best warrior?" His voice dropped, edged with quiet steel. "But it's worst?" The thought was horrifying. The Vorok had believed they were undefeated, that their warriors stood above all others. But if this was the skill of just one human, what happened when entire armies came for them? Zorval's stomach twisted. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to fear something. Cain exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You asked for this duel to prove your superiority. Now you know the truth." He gestured toward the warlords above, his voice dropping into something near a whisper, though every Vorok in the stadium could hear him. "How many of you are wondering right now if you picked the wrong species to fight?" The silence was suffocating. The Vorok had built their empire through blood and steel, through absolute, unwavering belief in their dominance. But that belief was dead now. Cain nodded once, satisfied, and turned. He walked away, unhurried, unconcerned, a man who had already decided the battle was over. He didn't need to look back to know what was happening behind him. The Vorok, the great warrior race, were staring at their fallen champion. And seeing themselves. For the first time in their long history, the Vorok understood they were no longer the apex predators of the galaxy. The humans had come. And they were already too late to stop them. The weight of silence pressed against the blood-steel arena, thick and suffocating. The Vorok had ruled the battlefield for centuries, undefeated, unquestioned, unchallenged. But now they were staring at the unthinkable. Their greatest warrior lay broken, and the human walked away as if it had been nothing at all. Cain didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel their eyes on him, the heavy, stunned stares of thousands of Vorok warriors. They weren't just looking at him. They were studying him. Searching for the trick, the illusion, the hidden force that had toppled a duel master. There was none. He reached the exit gate before the voice rang out from above. "Stop." Cain paused. Turned. The Vorok High warlord, his crimson war cloak hanging over his plated shoulders, leaned forward on his throne, the sharp ridges of his face cast in shadow. His voice was even, but beneath it was something dangerous, something just barely restrained. "You were given this duel as a test," the warlord said, slow and deliberate. To prove humanity's worth. And yet, you mock us. You humiliate our champion, our traditions, and then you walk away. Do you think this victory absolves your kind? Do you think this display will make us cower? Kane's eyes flickered to Zorval, who was still kneeling, breathing heavy, his broken wrist clutched to his chest. Blood ran down his arm, his side, staining the sacred sands of the arena. He was still alive. Barely. Kane exhaled through his nose. You're asking the wrong question. The warlord narrowed his eyes. Then enlighten me, human. Kane tilted his head slightly, voice calm. You shouldn't be asking whether I think this duel will make you cower. He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. You should be asking why I didn't kill him. The silence that followed was deafening. The Vorak were not a species that hesitated. When a warrior fell, they were finished. A battle did not end until one combatant lay dead. That was their way. Their law. Their truth. Yet Kane had spared Zorval. Not because of mercy. Because of something far, far worse. The warlord's fingers curled against the armrest of his throne. His jaw tightened. You expect us to believe this was restraint? Kane smirked, but there was no humor in it. No. I expect you to understand it. His voice carried through the arena, even, unshaken. You think your kind understands war. You don't. You understand combat. You understand duels. But war? War is something else. War isn't about honor. War is about winning. He gestured to Zorval, still motionless in the sand. You train to fight. We train to end fights. A ripple of unease spread through the Vorak. The truth of it was sinking in, slow and painful. Kane's voice didn't rise, didn't falter. If I wanted him dead, he'd be dead. He met the warlord's gaze without flinching. If I wanted all of you dead, you'd already be burning. A murmur. Barely a whisper. The warlord's jaw tightened further. Empty threats. Kane took a slow step forward, just enough to test the ground, just enough to push. Then test us. A single breath passed. The tension in the air felt like it could crack the sky. The warlord did not move. Kane let the silence stretch before he shrugged, turning away once more. Didn't think so. He walked toward the exit, unhurried. The weight of the moment, of the knowledge hanging over every Vorak present, followed him. One human had walked into their sacred arena. One human had walked out. And now, the Vorak knew what that meant. This was not the end. This was the warning. And next time, when humanity returned, they wouldn't be bringing just one.